20 years ago, the establishment of behavioral threat assessment and management teams in K-12 schools was an untested, novel idea. But now it's a common practice. And in fact, K-12 threat assessment teams are required by many states and being rapidly adopted in others. This should be regarded as a great step forward in protecting our schools and also providing assistance to troubled students. However, the practice of K-12 threat assessment is under attack. A national coalition of civil rights groups has taken an unequivocal stance against threat assessment. Their attack is widespread and sustained. They have lobbied Congress and the White House, and they've opposed threat assessment in many states and localities. What are their concerns? Well, for example, in February of this year, the Center for Disability Rights and 8 other organizations published a report alleging that threat assessment is discriminatory and dangerous to students of color and students with disabilities. They allege that threat assessment results in stigma and disruption to students, punitive and harmful suspension from school, and inappropriate arrest by law enforcement. Now, as the developer of a threat assessment model, I have a vested interest in this matter, but I think everyone in ATAP has an interest too. If threat assessment is opposed in K-12 schools as unfair and discriminatory, the same arguments can be made about threat assessment in higher education, in business, and in government agencies. Let me be clear that all of us want threat assessment to be a fair and equitable process. One of the reasons I was interested in developing a threat assessment model is because the existing practice of zero tolerance is not fair or equitable. Many students are being punished unfairly for minor misbehavior that does not pose a serious threat, usually by being suspended or expelled from school. And we know that the suspensions and expulsions were not equitable either, but were being administered disproportionately to students of color. School suspension is a disciplinary practice research has shown does not work and does more harm than good. As an organization, ATAP should affirm its wholehearted commitment to making threat assessment a fair and equitable process. The research we've conducted shows that schools using threat assessment have a reduction in the use of school suspension and a reduction in racial disparities. We have a randomized controlled trial, several other controlled studies showing no statistically significant differences in suspension rates by race or ethnicity for students who receive a threat assessment. Our studies also show that fewer than 1% of students are arrested. If you would like more information, go to the website for the Virginia Youth Violence Project at the University of Virginia. The civil rights groups dismiss our research on K-12 threat assessment as limited in scope and size. But our studies include hundreds of schools and thousands of threat assessment cases. The critics also point out that our research is primarily from one state, Virginia. And we certainly want more research, and I encourage everyone involved in school threat assessment to contribute. But we do have findings from other states. Last year, researchers at the University of Colorado, Denver, published a study of Colorado schools. Just like our studies, they found no disparities among Black, Hispanic, and white students for any of the disciplinary outcomes. They also found no disparities for students with disabilities. This year, we're conducting research in Florida, where there's a statewide requirement for schools to have threat assessment teams. We have a preliminary study of 1,100 threat assessment cases. And our findings for Florida are consistent with our findings in Virginia. Out-of-school suspension rates were just 26%, even lower than in Virginia. The expulsion rate was 1.6%. Fewer than 1% of students were arrested, and only about 2% were charged by law enforcement. These results are quite different than the allegations that threat assessment will produce massive suspensions and criminalization of students. Let's look at the allegations of racial and ethnic bias. In our Florida study, Black and Hispanic students did not receive disciplinary or law enforcement consequences at a higher rate than white students. Students with disabilities did not receive harsher consequences than other students. Our civil rights groups should be applauding the results of threat assessment in Florida schools. Threat assessment is protecting students from harsh disciplinary outcomes and protecting them from criminalization, because it is a process that carefully considers the student's intentions and capabilities, the context of the threat, and does not take a harsh zero-tolerance approach. In closing, let me say that we need to be concerned about fairness and equity of threat assessment, and schools in every state should be examining our outcomes, and where there's any indication of unfairness or inequity, we need to take action to remedy it. And yes, we need more research. We can only refute allegations with facts and evidence. That's what threat assessment is all about, facts and evidence. ATAP should be actively engaged in demonstrating that our process is fair and equitable.